The sky turned black at 3 in the afternoon. Not brown, black. On April 14th, 1935, a 1,000-foot wall of black dust swallowed the Texas Panhandle, dropped temperatures 30 degrees in an hour, and buried farmhouses to their windowsills. Inside a hole she had dug herself, Sarah Wilson pressed wet rags to her 3 children's faces and listened to the world ending. 60 feet away, inside a frame house with a tar paper roof, her neighbor's ceiling collapsed onto the children's beds. Both families faced the same storm. One mother had spent 6 long months digging while everyone laughed. The other waited. This is the story of a 4-inch ventilation pipe and the children who kept breathing because of it. Sarah Wilson pushed open the cellar door and choked on air that tasted like burnt earth. The sky above her had turned the color of a bruise. 30 minutes ago, that sky had been black as midnight, black enough that she could not see her own hand pressed against her face. Now a sickly twilight seeped across the Texas Panhandle, revealing a world buried in drifts of black dust 2 feet deep against her house. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees in under an hour. She had felt it plunge even in the cellar, felt the chills seep through the packed earth walls while her 3 children huddled against her, breathing through wet rags she had to change every 10 minutes as the cloth clogged with grit. But they were breathing. She counted heads again. 8-year-old Emma, 5-year-old Thomas, 2-year-old Daniel, still whimpering in her arms, his face streaked with mud where tears had mixed with dust. All alive, all conscious, all whole. 60 feet away, the Hendricks house sat silent. One corner of the roof had buckled inward. Through the broken window she could see dust piled on the furniture like gray snow. She called out Martha's name. No answer came back, just the moan of wind that still carried grit sharp enough to sting bare. Skin. Sarah's cellar had held. The 4-inch ventilation pipe she had installed, the one her husband thought was a waste of $3.50, still poked above the drifted dust, still drawing clean air down to where her children had waited out the darkness. But 6 months earlier, when she first drove her shovel into that hardpan ground, every man in town had told her she was digging her own grave. October 1834. The Wilson farm, 8 miles from the nearest town, 15 from the nearest doctor. Sarah stood at her kitchen window and watched the horizon disappear. A wall of brown dust rolled across the fields where wheat should have grown, where wheat had grown 4 years ago when she and John first claimed this 160 acres under the Homestead Act. The wheat was gone now. The topsoil was gone. Some days the sky was gone too, swallowed by storms that turned noon into dusk and left grit in the flour bin, the water jug, the children's beds. Thomas coughed in the next room, a wet, rattling sound that made her stomach clench. He had been coughing for 3 weeks. Emma had started coughing last Tuesday. Daniel, only 2, had not started yet, but every night Sarah checked his breathing, waiting for the rasp that meant dust had found his lungs too. 7,000 people would die of dust pneumonia before this drought ended. Sarah did not know that number yet. She only knew the Hartley boy had died last month, 6 years old, drowned in dry land by dirt his lungs could not expel. She had watched his mother carry the small body out on a table leaf, wrapped in a sheet that was already turning brown from the dust that fell even as they walked to the church. The Wilson family had $47 left. That number lived in Sarah's mind like a second heartbeat. $47 to last until spring planting, if spring brought rain, if seeds would grow, if John's relief work held out at $1 a day, 3 days a week. 3. Children with worsening coughs, $47. 8 miles to town through dust that could rise without warning, and a frame house with a tar paper roof that let grit sift through every crack no matter how many wet sheets she hung over the windows. The door banged open. John stamped in, shaking dust from his coat, and behind him came Frank Tolliver, the man who had lived on this land since 1908, who owned the only 2-story house in the area, who had survived 3 droughts already and never let anyone forget it. Tolliver's eyes swept the room and stopped on Thomas, curled on the bench with a rag pressed to his mouth. The old man shook his head. "Dust cough," he said. "Half the kids in the county got it. You keep him inside during storms, keep the sheets wet. He'll be fine come spring. The sheets aren't enough, Sarah said. The dust comes through the ceiling, through the walls. I find it in the children's beds every morning, no matter how tight I seal the room. Tolliver snorted. We've had dust for 4 years now. Ain't nobody died from a little dirt who didn't have weak lungs to begin with. He glanced at John, man to man. You get through it by staying inside and waiting it out. This drought will break like all the others. Always does. Sarah's hands tightened on the dish rag she was holding. The Hartley boy didn't have weak lungs. He was healthy until... The Hartley boy's mother wasn't keeping up with the cleaning, Tolliver cut in. Let dust pile up in the attic till the ceiling started bowing. That's not the weather's fault. That's not keeping house proper. He didn't look at Sarah when he said it. He didn't have to. John shifted his weight. Sarah's been talking about digging some kind of cellar, storm shelter. A cellar. Tolliver laughed, a short, sharp sound like a dog's bark. Digging holes in the ground is for prairie dogs. What's a hole going to do that a good house won't? Keep the dust out. He laughed again. Dust gets through everything. You dig a cellar, you'll just be sitting in a dusty hole instead of a dusty house. Underground might be. Underground floods when it rains, Tolliver said. Which it will, eventually. Then your children drown. That what you want? He shook his head at John. A woman digging in this hardpan is going to break her back and your patience. That's money you could spend on actual food, on seed for spring, on keeping those kids fed instead of building some fool hole that won't help anyway. John didn't argue. John was tired in a way that went deeper than his muscles, tired in his eyes and his voice and the slope of his shoulders. 3 years of failed crops, a year of relief work, a wife who kept talking about digging when he barely had strength to walk home at night. Tolliver left, and John left the conversation behind with him. Sarah stood alone in the kitchen, listening to Thomas cough, watching dust settle on the table she had wiped clean an hour ago. $47, 3 children, a frame house that could not protect them, and a husband who had already given up. How could anyone survive this? The answer came to Sarah on the night of the Hartley boy's funeral. She lay awake in the dark, listening to the wind scrape dust against the windows, and remembered her grandmother's stories. Kansas, 1879. A twister had dropped out of a green sky and taken the Prentice farmhouse whole. Walls, roof, furniture, everything sucked up into the clouds and scattered across 3 counties. But the Prentice family had lived. All 7 of them, huddled in a cellar dug 10 feet from the house, dug deep enough that the tornado's fingers could not reach them. The twister took the house, her grandmother had said, but it couldn't take the whole. Sarah turned the idea over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by water. A tornado was wind. Dust was wind carrying dirt. If a hole in the ground could protect a family from a tornado, could it protect them from dust that fell like rain? She thought about what she knew. Underground meant sealed from the air above. Below grade meant cooler, damper, and dust did not penetrate damp surfaces as readily. She had seen that herself, seen how the wet sheets caught more grit than the dry walls. A cellar with packed earth walls, walls she could wet down before a storm, would catch the dust before it reached her children's lungs. One entrance meant only 1 point to seal. Not a dozen windows and door frames and cracks in the tar paper, but a single door she could pull tight behind her. And if she ran a pipe up through the ceiling, a ventilation pipe tall enough to reach above the drifting dust, they would have clean air even if the storm buried the door. The next morning, she sketched the design on the back of an envelope, 8 feet by 10 feet, 6 feet deep, timber supports for the walls, an angled door that would shed debris instead of catching it, a 4-inch pipe, extending 3 feet above ground level. The location mattered. 30 feet from the house, close enough to reach quickly when a storm appeared on the horizon, far enough that if the house collapsed, it would not block the cellar door. She showed the sketch to John that evening. He studied it for a long moment, his calloused thumb tracing the dimensions. How much? Timber supports will cost about $12. Ventilation pipe, $3.50. Hardware for the door, $2. She hesitated. $18 total, maybe a bit more. That's near half what we got. I know. And if we spend that and then we need seed money come spring, I know. John set the envelope down. Tolliver says this drought will break, says it always does. Tolliver's chickens are dying, Sarah said. I saw them yesterday. Half his flock is gone. He burned the bodies behind his barn so the neighbors wouldn't see. She leaned forward. He doesn't know any more than we do. He's just been lucky. Longer. John rubbed his eyes. He looked older than 34. Looked like his father had looked in the photographs from before the war between the states. If you're wrong about this cellar, then we have a cool place to store vegetables, Sarah said. A root cellar for the canned goods. It won't be wasted. And if you're right and you don't dig it? Neither of them said the words. Neither of them had to. Thomas coughed in the next room, a sound like paper tearing, and the silence that followed was answer enough. The next day, Sarah borrowed a pickaxe from the Hendricks farm and drove the blade into the ground 30 feet from her front door. The soil was baked hard as brick. The first swing barely scratched the surface. The second opened a crack an inch deep. The third sent a shock up her arms that made her teeth rattle. She swung again. Martha Hendricks appeared at the fence an hour later, watching Sarah chip away at the earth, one handful at a time. Martha was 40 years old, mother of 2, practical. In the way that prairie women had to be practical, she had survived by not wasting effort on anything that didn't work. What are you digging? She asked. Storm cellar. Martha was quiet for a moment. You really think a hole's going to keep the dust out? It gets through everything. You know that better than anyone. Underground is different. Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead, streaking her face with dirt. Sealed, damp, one door instead of 20 cracks. And what about when it rains? That hole will flood and your children will drown. I'm angling the door, sloping the floor toward a drainage channel. Sarah gestured at her sketch pinned to a fence post with a rock. Water runs out. Dust doesn't run anywhere. Martha studied the sketch. Sarah could see her working through the logic, see the objections forming and dissolving behind her eyes. Finally, she shook her head. Even if you dig it, you'll be digging for weeks. Who's going to tend the children? Cook the meals? Keep your house from burying itself while you're out here breaking your back? I'll manage. And your husband? He's letting me try. That was the truth of it. John had not agreed. He had simply stopped arguing. The distinction mattered less than Sarah wished it did. Martha lingered a moment longer, then turned back toward her own house. Her own frame house with its tar paper roof and its dozen windows and its ceilings that groaned under the weight of dust every time a storm passed through. I hope you're right, she said. I truly do. She did not offer to help. Sarah had not expected her to. The pickaxe rose and fell. The hole deepened by inches, and somewhere to the north, the dust was already rising. Word spread through the county like dust through a screen door. By the second week of November, everyone within 10 miles knew that the Wilson woman was digging a hole in the ground. The men talked about it at Wilkins's general store while they waited for mail that never brought good news. The women whispered about it after church while their children coughed in the pews. She thinks she knows better than folks who've lived here 20 years. That Tolliver says it's the dumbest thing he's seen since Henderson tried to grow rice in the drought of '09. Her husband just lets her do it. What kind of man lets his wife dig like a hired hand? John heard the talk at his relief work. The men didn't say anything to his face, but he caught the sideways glances, the smirks that vanished when he looked up. One afternoon, Miller from the next section over asked if Sarah was wearing pants yet. John didn't answer. He didn't have the energy to fight, and he wasn't sure anymore that Miller was wrong to laugh. The confrontation Sarah had been expecting came on the third Sunday of November in the yard outside the general store. Earl Wilkins was 50 years old, the kind of man who measured his worth by the debts other people owed him. Half the families in the county had credit at his store. Credit he extended with a smile and collected with a ledger book that never forgot a cent. The Wilsons owed him $11.37. Sarah knew the number exactly because Wilkins had mentioned it twice in the past month. "Mrs. Wilson?" He stepped into her path as she left the store, a paper sack of flour in her arms. "I hear you're building something out at your place." "A storm cellar." "A storm cellar." He drew the words out like they tasted bad. "With the $12 you spent at Morrison's lumberyard last week, $12 that could have gone toward your account here." Sarah kept her voice even. The lumber was necessary. Necessary for what? For a hole in the ground that's going to fill up with snakes and spiders? Wilkins smiled, but his eyes didn't. "I've been patient with your family, Mrs. Wilson. Extended credit when others wouldn't, but I can't keep doing that for folks who don't show sense." The threat hung in the air between them. Without credit at Wilkins's store, the Wilsons would have to ride 15 miles to the next town for supplies. In dust storm season, 15 miles might as well be 100. "That cellar will keep my children alive when the big storms come," Sarah said. "The big storms." Wilkins shook his head. "You sound like those Dust Bowl hysterics from the government. We've had dust for 4 years. We'll have dust for another 4. And then the rain will come back, same as it always does." He leaned closer. "But you keep throwing money into holes in the ground, and I'll have to start wondering if you're good for what you owe. You understand?" Sarah understood. She also understood that Wilkins owned 200 acres of dryland wheat that hadn't produced a crop in 3 years, that his store was the only thing keeping him solvent, that every dollar she spent at Morrison's was a dollar that didn't go into his register. "I'll pay what I owe," she said. "After spring planting." "After spring planting." Wilkins stepped aside. "We'll see about that." She walked home with the flour sack growing heavier in her arms, with her shoulders tight and her jaw clenched. Emma walked beside her, old enough at 8 to sense something wrong, young enough to stay quiet about it. They passed the Tolliver place. The old man sat on his porch watching them go by, and he didn't wave. They passed the Hendricks house. Martha was hanging laundry on a line, laundry that would be gray with dust before it dried, and she looked up but didn't speak. 8 miles from town, 15 miles from a doctor, and now the store credit that kept them fed was balanced on a merchant's grudge. The hole was 4 feet deep. Sarah needed 6. She picked up the shovel and went back to digging. December. The hardpan layer waited for her at 4.5 feet, a stratum of soil baked so hard by decades of sun that her pickaxe bounced off it like she was striking stone. Sarah spent 3 days attacking that layer with everything she had. She broke the handle of her old pickaxe. She spent $4 on a new one, money that came out of the dwindling savings like blood from a wound. $39 left. The cold came with the hardpan. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night, and the ground that had been merely difficult became brutal. Her hands cracked and bled. She wrapped them in rags and kept swinging. When Thomas saw the blood seeping through the cloth, he asked if she was dying. She told him no. Mama's hands were just tired, and she kept swinging. John came home from relief work on Christmas Eve with news. The government program was shutting down for the holiday. No work until January 2nd. 10 days without the $1-a-day wage they had come to depend on. He found Sarah in the cellar, 6 feet down now, finally through the hardpan and into softer soil beneath. She had rigged a rope and bucket system to haul dirt out of the hole. But the work was still brutal. Dig, fill the bucket, climb the ladder, dump the bucket, climb back down, dig again. Her dress hung loose on her frame. She had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. John stood at the edge of the hole and looked down at his wife in the fading light. "I'll help," he said. It was the first time he had offered. Sarah didn't ask what had changed his mind, whether it was the holiday, or the sight of her bleeding hands, or the simple fact that the hole was now too deep for one person to manage alone. She just handed him the shovel and climbed out to work the bucket rope. They finished the excavation by December 28th, 8 feet by 10 feet, 6 feet deep. The walls were rough, the floor uneven, but the space was there, a rectangle of darkness carved out of land that had tried to kill them. $32 left. Timber support still needed. January brought a traveling lumber dealer through the county, his wagon piled with salvage from a bankrupt farm up in Kansas. Sarah bought enough timber to frame the cellar walls for $12. A fair price, the dealer said, considering the quality. She didn't tell him she had calculated exactly how much she could spend and still have enough left for seed corn in April. $20 left. John was back at relief work, but he helped each evening, driving posts into the corners, nailing cross braces to keep the walls from caving in. The children helped too. Emma hauled water from the well to dampen the packed earth walls. Thomas carried tools back and forth, resting between trips when his cough got bad. Even Daniel toddled around the site, picking up nails and putting them in a coffee can, proud of his contribution. On January 22nd, a storm hit. They heard it coming before they saw it, a low roar from the northwest, a sound like a train that never arrived. Sarah grabbed Daniel from his nap, shouted for the other children, and ran for the cellar. It had no door yet, just a canvas tarp stretched over the opening and weighted with stones. They huddled on the bare earth floor, the tarp flapping and snapping above them, dust swirling through every gap. Sarah pulled wet rags from the bucket she had prepared, always a bucket of wet rags now, always ready, and pressed them to the children's faces. The storm lasted 4 hours. When it passed, they climbed out to find the house half buried in drifts, the windows so caked with grit that no light came through. It took 6 hours to clean the inside enough to cook dinner. It took 2 days to clear the drifts from the doors. But in the cellar, with its packed earth walls and its rough-hewn timber frame, the dust had been manageable. The wet rags worked. The children coughed less than they would have in the house. Proof of concept, Sarah said to John that night, her voice hoarse from the grit she had still breathed despite the rags. It works. The door, John said. We need the door. February. The ventilation pipe cost $3.50. Galvanized metal, 4 inches in diameter, tall enough to reach above any drift. Sarah installed it herself, cutting a hole in the timber ceiling, sealing the gaps with pitch she rendered from pine sap collected during a rare clear day. The door took longer. She built it from salvaged barn wood, planks she pried from an abandoned homestead 3 miles east. The owners had fled to California 6 months ago, leaving behind everything too heavy to carry. Sarah told herself they wouldn't mind. She told herself they would understand. The angled frame was the tricky part. She had to cut each piece at a precise slant so the door would shed debris instead of catching it. Her first attempt didn't fit. Her second attempt fit but wouldn't open. Her third attempt held. $16 left. Barely enough for seed corn. Nothing left for emergencies. On February 3rd, a windstorm ripped the canvas tarp off the cellar entrance before the door was hung. Sarah spent half a day chasing debris across the prairie, then half a day repairing damage to the timber frame. She fell into bed that night, too exhausted to eat dinner. On February 20th, John collapsed at the relief work site. Influenza, the foreman said. Stay home until you can stand without swaying. John spent 2 weeks in bed, unable to help, unable to work, unable to do anything but watch Sarah carry the load alone. She hung the door on March 1st. 2 iron hinges, 1 iron latch, all purchased with the last of her hardware budget. The door swung open. The door swung closed. The seal wasn't perfect. She could see daylight through gaps at the edges, but she stuffed the gaps with rags and told herself it would hold. March 8th. She opened the cellar to stock emergency supplies and found a mouse nest in the corner, droppings on the floor, chew marks on the timber. She spent a day cleaning, sealing, setting traps. She caught 3 mice before they stopped coming. March 15th. The cellar was complete. Sarah stood at the entrance and surveyed her work. 8 feet by 10 feet, 6 feet deep. Timber walls, packed earth floor, angled door, ventilation pipe. Inside, 2 gallons of water in sealed jugs, a tin of crackers, candles, matches, 1 kerosene lantern, 12 clean rags, 2 blankets. The total cost, $19.50. The total labor, 240 hours, give or take. John came and stood beside her. He had recovered from the influenza, but he still looked thin, still looked tired. They both looked thin now. They both looked tired. "Think it'll hold?" he asked. "I think so." "Against a real one? A black one?" Sarah didn't answer. She didn't know. The storms they had weathered so far were brown, bad, but survivable. The old-timers talked about black blizzards, storms so thick they blotted out the sun, storms that killed cattle where they stood and buried farmhouses to the windowsills. There hadn't been a true black blizzard yet this year, but March was only half over, and the ground was drier than ever. 1934 had been the worst drought year in a millennium, and 1935 was shaping up to be just as bad. "What about Martha?" John asked. Sarah looked toward the Hendricks house, 60 feet away. Frame construction, tar paper roof, no cellar. Martha had come by once in February with a pot of bean soup, and Sarah had tried to show her the cellar design, tried to explain how it worked, but Martha had just shaken her head. "Can't afford the timber," she had said. "Can't afford the time. Maybe next year if the rain comes back." Next year. If. "She's got 2 children," Sarah said. 10 and 7. Good kids. John nodded. Neither of them said anything else. The next morning, Sarah walked her children through the drill one more time, from the house to the cellar in 60 seconds or less. Grab the water jug, grab the rag bag, get underground. Emma went first, carrying the jug. Thomas went second, dragging the rag bag. Sarah went last with Daniel in her arms, counting seconds in her head. 58, 59, 60. They made it. "Again," Sarah said. They ran the drill 3 more times. By the end, they had it down to 45 seconds. "Good," Sarah said. "Now we wait." The calendar on the kitchen wall showed March 15th. 20 days until April, 20 days until spring, until planting season, until the storms were supposed to ease. 20 days. Outside, the wind shifted. Sarah watched the dust rise on the horizon, brown, not black, just another ordinary storm. She herded the children into the cellar and pulled the door shut behind her. The seals held. The pipe drew air. The wet rags caught the grit. It was working. Against ordinary storms, it was working. But the real test hadn't come. The black blizzard, the one Tolliver and Wilkins and all the others kept warning about. That storm was still out there, somewhere beyond the horizon, waiting. Sarah pressed a rag to Thomas's face and listened to the wind scream. April came in like a thief. The first week brought 12 days of dense dust at Dodge City, visibility measured in feet, not miles. Sarah heard the reports from travelers passing through, heard the numbers that meant nothing and everything. 60 feet, 100 feet, 300 feet on a good day. She filed the information away and kept running drills with the children. On April 4th, a moderate storm rolled through. The Wilsons reached the cellar in 43 seconds. They stayed underground for 3 hours while the wind screamed and the dust fell. When they emerged, Sarah measured the accumulation inside the cellar, a 1/4 inch of fine grit on the floor. In the house, 2 inches covered every surface. That night, John admitted what Sarah had been waiting months to hear. This might have been worth it after all. She didn't gloat. She was too tired for that. And besides, the cellar had only been tested against a brown storm. The old-timers kept talking about the black ones, the storms that came from the north instead of the west, the storms that carried dirt from 5 states, the storms that turned midday into midnight. Frank Tolliver found her at the well 3 days later. "That wasn't a real storm," he said without preamble. "That was a Tuesday. Wait until a black one comes. Your little hole won't help then." Sarah hauled up the bucket and poured water into her jug. "We'll see. Ground's dry enough now that a real blow will bury that cellar door shut. You'll suffocate down there in your own grave." He spat into the dust. "Mark my words." Earl Wilkins had his own prediction, delivered with a smile when Sarah came to pay down her account. "You got lucky with that April storm, but luck runs out. When the big one comes, and it will, You'll wish you'd spent that cellar money on food instead. He made a notation in his ledger. You still owe $8.12. Sarah counted out $3 in dare coins. $5.12 now. Wilkins took the money without thanking her. The bell over his door rang as she left. The days stretched longer. The sun climbed higher. The temperature rose into the 70s, then the 80s, and the wind died to nothing. That was the part that worried Sarah most. The stillness. On April 13th, she stood on her porch and watched the birds. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, moving in flocks that wheeled and turned in patterns she had never seen before. They were flying south, all of them, flying away from something. Rabbits crossed the fields in the same direction, running in daylight when they usually hid. The air smelled wrong, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. That night, Sarah moved extra water into the cellar, extra rags, an extra blanket. She checked the ventilation pipe, checked the door seals, checked everything twice. John watched her from the porch. You feel it too? Something's coming. Might just be weather changing, spring coming in proper. Might be. Neither of them believed it. April 14th dawned clear and blue and perfect. Sarah woke to silence. No wind. For the first time in months, no grit tapped against the windows, no dust sifted under the door. She opened her eyes to actual sunlight streaming through glass that was almost clean. The thermometer on the porch read 62 degrees at sunrise. By 10 o'clock, it had climbed to 75. By noon, 81. John declared it a holiday. The children played outside for the first time in weeks, real play, running and shouting and rolling in what passed for grass. Sarah hung laundry on the line without worrying it would turn gray before it dried. She opened every window in the house to let the clean air sweep through. They were not alone. Across the county, families emerged blinking into the sunshine. Church services that morning were well attended. Afterward, people lingered in the yard, faces turned toward the sky, talking about whether the worst had finally passed. Maybe the drought's breaking, Martha Hendricks said. She had walked over with her 2 children, and they chased the Wilson children around the yard while the mothers watched. Maybe we'll get rain this year. Maybe, Sarah said, but she kept glancing north. At 3 o'clock, the children were still playing. John had walked into town for supplies. Sarah was hanging the last of the laundry, a white sheet that actually looked white, when she noticed the birds again. They were flying south. Hundreds of them. Faster than before, in tight formations, silent where birds should be calling. And behind them from the north came rabbits. Dozens of rabbits, running across the open fields as if something was chasing them. Sarah dropped the sheet. The horizon had changed. Where blue sky should have met brown earth, there was a wall. Black. Not brown, not tan, not any color she had seen in 4 years of dust storms. Black like ink. Black like the inside of a grave. It stretched from east to west as far as she could see, and it was moving. No wind yet. No sound. Just that silent wall of darkness rolling toward them, 1,000 feet high, swallowing the sky as it came. Children. Sarah's voice came out strange, too calm for what she was seeing. Children, come here now. Emma looked up from her game. She saw her mother's face and stopped asking questions. Thomas, Emma, now, run for the cellar. The wall was 3 miles away, maybe 4. Moving at 60 miles an hour, though Sarah didn't know that yet. She only knew she had minutes. Daniel. Where was Daniel? She found him behind the house, poking at something in the dirt. She grabbed him so hard he started crying. She didn't care. She was already running. Mama, what? Don't talk. Run. Emma, grab the water jug. Thomas, the rag bag. Go, go, go. 30 feet to the cellar. The same 30 feet they had drilled a dozen times. But now the sky behind them was dying. Now the temperature was dropping so fast Sarah could feel it on her bare arms. And now the first edge of the wind touched her back like a cold hand. Emma reached the cellar door first. She grabbed the handle and pulled. Thomas stumbled behind her, dragging the rag bag, coughing already. Sarah shoved Daniel through the opening and turned to look back. The wall had eaten the Hendricks house. She watched it disappear, one moment there, the next swallowed by black. The roar hit her a split second later, a sound like 1,000 freight trains, and she dove through the cellar door and pulled it shut behind her. Darkness. Total, absolute darkness. Thicker than any night she had ever known. She could not see the children. She could not see her own hands. She could only hear the wind screaming and the thunder of 1,000,000 tons of dirt falling from the sky. "Mama?" Emma's voice, small and frightened. "I'm here. Everyone stay still. I'm going to light the lantern." Her hands shook as she found the matches. The first one broke. The second one lit, flared, and she touched it to the lantern wick. The cellar sprang into view. 8 feet by 10 feet of packed earth and timber, and in the center, 3 children with terrified eyes, already covered in a fine layer of black dust. It was getting in. Through the gaps in the door, through cracks she had thought she sealed, the dust was seeping into their refuge. But it was seeping, not pouring. The walls were catching most of it. The wet rags were ready. Sarah handed a rag to Emma. "Over your nose and mouth. Don't take it off." She did the same for Thomas. Then Daniel, who was still crying, who didn't understand why they were in the dark hole, why his mother's hands were shaking, why the world outside sounded like it was ending. The roar grew louder. The timbers groaned. Dust fell from the ceiling in streams, and Sarah realized with sick horror that the ceiling might collapse, that the weight of what was falling might be too much for the supports to bear. She pressed her children against the wall, shielding them with her body, and prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening. The lantern flickered. "Mama, the light—" "It's okay. The air is just a little thin." She remembered reading somewhere that flames needed oxygen, that if there wasn't enough air, the fire would die. The ventilation pipe. Was it still clear? Was it pulling in clean air, or was it clogged with dust? The lantern went out. Now the darkness was complete. Sarah could not see the children she was touching. She could only feel them pressed against her, could only hear their ragged breathing through the wet rags, could only smell the thick alkaline stench of dirt that had traveled 1,000 miles to bury them. "Stay still. Keep the rags on your faces. I need to check something." She felt along the wall to the corner where she had left the hoe. Her fingers closed around the handle. She reached up, found the bottom of the ventilation pipe, and pushed the handle up into the opening. Resistance. Something was blocking it. She pushed harder. The blockage gave way, crumbled, and she felt a draft of air, not clean, not fresh, but air flowing down from above. The pipe was still working. The dust had just accumulated at the base. She poked the handle through twice more, clearing the passage, then returned to the children. "Okay, it's okay. The pipe is clear. We just have to wait." How long? She didn't know. The other storms had lasted hours. This one, this black monster that had swallowed the sun, might last longer, might last forever. Thomas started coughing. It was a bad cough, the kind that started deep in the chest and rattled all the way up. Sarah wet a fresh rag from the water jug and pressed it to his face, but the coughing continued, each spasm shaking his small body. Breathe slow, through the cloth. Slow breaths. Daniel started screaming. It was the darkness, the noise, the terror of a 2-year-old who didn't understand why his world had become a black pit full of monsters. Sarah gathered him against her chest, rocking, murmuring words that didn't matter. Then he vomited. Dust. He had swallowed dust during the run to the cellar, and now his body was rejecting it. Sarah felt the hot wetness spread across her dress, smelled the acid tang of bile mixing with dirt. She had to clean him, had to get the mask back on his face, had to do it all in darkness, so complete she might as well have been blind. She worked by touch, wiped his face with a rag, got him to drink water, small sips between sobs, put a fresh cloth over his mouth, all while the wind howled and the timbers creaked and Thomas coughed beside her. 30 minutes, an hour. Time lost meaning in the dark. Somewhere outside, 60 feet away, Martha Hendricks was living through the same storm. Sarah thought about her frame house with its tar paper roof, its windows sealed with wet sheets, its ceiling that groaned under the weight of dust that fell and kept falling. She thought about Martha's children, 10-year-old William and 7-year-old Grace, huddled somewhere in that house while the sky buried them. She should have made Martha build a cellar. Should have insisted. Should have dug it herself if she had to. Too late now. Too late for anything but waiting. The storm went on. Sarah poked the ventilation pipe every 10 minutes. She changed the rags every time they clogged. She held Daniel when he cried, and Thomas when he coughed, and Emma when she whispered that she was scared. 45 minutes after the darkness fell, the roar began to fade. Not stopped, the wind still screamed, the dust still fell, but the peak had passed. The absolute blackness lifted by degrees, and through the gaps in the door, Sarah saw not light, but the absence of total dark. "Is it over?" Emma's voice muffled by her rag. "Not yet. Stay down. Keep the cloth on." Another hour. The wind dropped from a scream to a howl to a moan. The temperature in the cellar, which had dropped when the cold front hit, began to stabilize. At 5:15, Sarah cracked the cellar door. The air outside was thick with grit, but she could see. The sky was the color of a bruise, purple and gray and sick. Her house still stood, half buried in drifts of black dust. The laundry line was gone. The fence posts were buried to their tops, and 60 feet away, the Hendricks house had a hole in its roof. "Stay here," Sarah told the children. "Do not come out until I come back for you." She pushed through dust that came up to her knees. The wind still gusted, throwing grit into her eyes, but she could breathe without a rag now, could see well enough to find her way. She reached the Hendricks house and pulled open the door. Dust everywhere, piled on the furniture, drifted against the walls, and in the bedroom, the children's bedroom, the ceiling had caved in. She could see the hole from inside. The rafters had cracked under the weight of accumulating dust, and the ceiling plaster had fallen onto the beds, burying them in debris. If anyone had been sleeping there. "Martha?" A sound from the main room. Sarah pushed through the door and found them. Martha was under the kitchen table, both children pressed against her. William was coughing, the deep, wet cough that Sarah knew too well. Grace was silent, her eyes huge, her face streaked with tears and mud. "Sarah." Martha's voice cracked. "The ceiling. The dust kept falling, and I could hear it up there, and then, are you hurt? Are the children hurt?" I don't think William can't stop coughing." Sarah knelt beside the table. William's breathing was labored, each inhale a battle. He had been breathing unfiltered dust for nearly 2 hours. "We need to get them to clean air. Can you walk?" Martha nodded. Her legs were shaking, but she stood, pulling her children with her. They made their way through the drifted dust to the Wilson house. It was filthy inside, every surface, coated, every crack infiltrated, but the structure was sound. Sarah settled the Hendricks family in the main room and went back for her own children. The cellar had held. The ventilation pipe still poked above the drift line, the door still sealed. Sarah gathered Emma, Thomas, and Daniel and brought them home. That night, both families slept in the same room, too exhausted to separate, too shaken to be alone. William's cough worsened as the hours passed. By morning, he had a fever. April 15th. The sun rose on a transformed world. Drifts of black dust covered the roads, some rising 20 feet high against barns and windbreaks. Fences had disappeared entirely, buried or ripped away. The wheat fields, what remained of them, lay under a blanket of dirt carried from Kansas and Nebraska and Colorado. 300,000 tons of topsoil had fallen from the sky in a single afternoon. Sarah didn't know that number yet. She only knew that her children were alive and that William Hendricks was getting worse. By noon, his fever had spiked. By evening, his breathing had turned to a wheeze. each inhale accompanied by a wet rattle that made Sarah's stomach clench. "Dust pneumonia," Martha whispered. "Oh God, it's dust pneumonia." Sarah had seen it before, had seen children go from coughing to wheezing to drowning in their own lungs over the span of a week, had watched the Hartley boy's mother carry that small body out on a table leaf. "It doesn't have to be," she said. "Keep him upright. Keep the air as clean as you can. Steam from boiling water. It helps loosen what's in his chest." They fought for William for 3 days, changed rags, boiled water, kept him propped up even when he cried from exhaustion. On April 18th, the fever broke. His breathing eased. The wet rattle faded to a dry cough, and then to silence. He would live. Martha found Sarah by the well that afternoon. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there while Sarah hauled up the bucket. Then, "I should have listened." Sarah poured water into her jug. "You're listening now. If I had built a cellar, you couldn't afford it. You said so yourself. I could have found the money, could have found the time." Martha's voice cracked. "My children almost died because I was too proud to dig a hole in the ground." Sarah looked at her neighbor, at the woman who had brought bean soup in February without ever admitting she believed in the cellar, at the woman who had almost lost everything because she had waited too long. "So help someone else build one," Sarah said. "Teach them what you learned. That's how you pay it back." 2 days later, Frank Tolliver appeared at Sarah's cellar. He stood at the entrance for a long moment, studying the angled door, the ventilation pipe, the timber frame visible through the opening. His face was unreadable. "Lost half my chickens," he said finally. "The other half might not make it. Found them standing in the coop with their lungs full of dirt. Still upright, like they just forgot how to breathe." Sarah waited. She knew there was more. "My wife's been coughing. Not bad yet. But it's there." He turned to look at her. "That pipe, that's what made the difference, isn't it? A lot of cellars don't have proper ventilation. It pulls clean air from above the drift line. You have to keep it clear during the storm, but it works." Tolliver nodded slowly. "I wonder if you'd show me how you angled that door. Keep the dust from piling up against it." It wasn't an apology. Sarah hadn't expected one, but it was something better. An acknowledgement that she had been right, that her months of labor and sacrifice had meaning. "I can show you tomorrow," she said. "Bring your tools." By April 20th, 3 families had asked Sarah for help building cellars. She taught them freely, shared her design, walked them through the construction, recommended the same pipe supplier she had used. She drew diagrams on scraps of paper and answered questions until her voice gave out. The Hendricks family started digging on April 21st. Martha swung the pickaxe herself while her children hauled dirt. "Should have done this 6 months ago," she said. Her face was grim, determined. She didn't stop for lunch. Earl Wilkins never admitted he was wrong. He nodded at Sarah when she came into his store, processed her payments without comment, and never mentioned the cellar again. But in June, a shipment of galvanized ventilation pipes arrived at his store, more than anyone had ordered. "Wholesale price," he said when people asked. Good deal came up. He sold them at cost. By summer's end, 8 families in the area had storm cellars. By the following spring, that number had doubled. The angled door ventilated design that Sarah had sketched on the back of an envelope became the standard across the county. The drought didn't break in 35. It didn't break in 36 or 37 either. More black blizzards came, though none as terrible as Black Sunday. More dust fell. More crops failed, but fewer children died. The families with cellars reported 0 fatalities from the storms. They reported fewer cases of dust pneumonia. They reported something harder to measure, but just as real. Hope. A hole in the ground dug by a woman who refused to accept the verdict of men who had given up. 13 days after Black Sunday, President Roosevelt signed the Soil Conservation Act. Sarah didn't know about it until weeks later when John brought home a newspaper from town. The government was finally acting. Programs to plant trees, to teach farmers how to prevent erosion, to buy back land that should never have been plowed. Too late for some, not too late for others. The Wilson family stayed on their land through 1936. They planted cover crops when the government men told them to, terraced their fields, did everything they could to hold the soil in place. But the drought didn't break, and the debts kept mounting. In 1937, John took a job with the Soil Conservation Service. The government was buying back ruined farmland, paying farmers to leave, and someone had to process the paperwork. It paid better than relief work, better than farming land that wouldn't grow. By 1939, when the rains finally returned, the Wilsons had saved enough to make a choice. They could stay and try again, or they could start over somewhere else. They chose California. Not as refugees, not like the Hartleys, who had fled in 1934 with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The Wilsons sold their land to the government buyback program, packed their belongings into a truck they owned outright, and drove west with money in their pockets and a plan for the future. Emma, 13 by then, asked if she could bring something from the farm. She chose a chunk of timber from the cellar wall, a piece her mother had cut and fitted during that desperate December. She kept it in her bedroom in California, and later in her own house when she married, and still later in a display case where her grandchildren would ask about it. "That's from the cellar that saved us," she would tell them. "Your great-grandmother built it with her own hands when everyone said she was crazy." The storm cellar itself remained on the land. The house was torn down in 1953, too damaged by years of dust and neglect to repair. A new family built a new home on the same spot, a family who had never seen a black blizzard and couldn't quite believe the stories. But they kept the cellar. The timber supports were replaced with concrete in 1958. The ventilation pipe was upgraded to a mechanical system in 1965. The basic design, underground, sealed, ventilated, remained unchanged. The principles spread. The government published guidelines based on cellars like Sarah's. Storm shelters became standard features on high plains farms by the 1940s. The same design principles appeared in FEMA guidelines decades later. Modern tornado shelters specify minimum ventilation, 2 square inches per occupant. Sarah's 4-inch pipe had provided about 12 square inches, more than adequate for her family of 5. She had calculated correctly without knowing the formula, working from instinct and observation and desperate necessity. The cellar design passed from neighbor to neighbor, town to town, generation to generation. It evolved with new materials and new technology, but the core insight never changed. Underground meant protection. Sealed meant survival. Ventilated meant breathing when the air outside turned to poison. A woman figured that out in 1934 in a farmhouse in the Texas Panhandle, while her children coughed and her neighbors laughed and the sky turned black with the topsoil of 5 states. There's a spot in the Texas Panhandle where the grass grows green now, not the dust-choked stubble of the dirty 30s, but real grass, the kind that holds soil in place, the kind that bends in the wind instead of tearing loose. Prairie restoration, they call it, repairing what the plow-up destroyed. The farmhouse is gone. The fences are gone. The roads have been rerouted, and the town 8 miles away has shrunk to a post office and a grain elevator. But if you know where to look, you can find what remains. The storm cellar is still there, partially collapsed now, the timber long rotted, the concrete replacement crumbling. But the stone walls that Sarah's husband laid in January of 1935 still stand, still mark the dimensions of that 8 by 10 refuge. And the ventilation pipe, rusted thin, bent by decades of wind, still pokes above the prairie grass. 4 inches in diameter, 3 feet above ground level, exactly as Sarah designed it. Researchers have come to photograph it. Students have written papers about it. The County Historical Society put up a marker in 2008 calling it an example of grassroots adaptation during the Dust Bowl crisis. Sarah would have laughed at that. Grassroots, a hole in the ground. She died in 1971 in a house in Fresno with a garden in the backyard and grandchildren who had never seen a dust storm. Her obituary mentioned that she had survived the Dust Bowl. It didn't mention the cellar. It didn't mention the 240 hours she spent digging while her neighbors laughed, or the $19.50 she gambled when gambling wrong meant her children would die. Some things don't fit in obituaries, but the cellar remains, And on days when the wind blows hard across the Texas panhandle, when the dust rises in thin brown curtains that are nothing like the black blizzards of 1935, that rusted pipe still catches the breeze. It still draws air. It still works. A mother dug a hole in the ground because she wanted her children to keep breathing. 90 years later, the principle holds.